There are certain smells that don't just enter a room, they enter a memory. The moment I lifted the lid on that pot of beef stew, the steam rising slow and thick into the cold November air of my kitchen, I was 19 years old again. Standing in my mother's house in rural Tennessee, watching her stir that same pot with the same patient grace she brought to everything she did. My wife Ruth had learned the recipe from her. Sat at that woman's kitchen table for an entire afternoon writing it down in her careful, looping handwriting on a notepad that I still keep in the drawer beside the stove. After Ruth passed, that notepad became one of the most precious things I owned. My son Daniel's 38th birthday was the first one in 3 years where the whole family would be together under one roof. His daughter, my granddaughter Lily, had been the one to suggest it. 8 years old, gap-toothed, and fiercer than anyone twice her age, she had called me on a Tuesday morning from her father's phone and said, "Grandpa, we should do something really special this year. Something Grandma would have liked." I had to step outside onto the back porch so she wouldn't hear my voice catch. I spent 2 days preparing. The stew needed time. The flavors had to develop slowly. The carrots, the potatoes, the thick gravy that Ruth always said was the soul of the whole dish. Lily and her younger brother, my grandson Cooper, came over that Saturday morning to help. Cooper was 5 and mostly interested in eating the raw carrots, but Lily took her role seriously. She wore one of my old aprons that swallowed her whole and stood on a step stool beside me at the stove, stirring with the focus of someone performing surgery. "Is this how Grandma used to do it?" she asked me, and I said, "Exactly like that, sweetheart, slow and steady." She straightened with a pride that made my chest ache. By mid-afternoon, the house smelled like every good thing I had ever known. I set the table the way Ruth always had the good dishes. The ones we kept for occasions, the ones with the small blue flowers around the rim that she had picked out herself at a shop in Gatlinburg the summer before we got married. I folded the napkins into triangles the way she taught me. I placed a small vase of yellow chrysanthemums in the center because they were Daniel's favorite, always had been, even as a little boy, and Ruth would clip them from the backyard garden every fall. The rest of the family began to arrive around 4. My brother Walt and his wife came first, bringing a peach cobbler and the easy comfort of people who have known you for 60 years. Daniel arrived with Lily and Cooper a few minutes later, and when he walked through the door and caught the smell of the stew, something moved across his face that I recognized. The same thing that moved across mine when I lifted the lid. He came over and put his arm around my shoulder and didn't say a word for a long moment. He didn't need to. His wife, Renee, arrived separately. She had been visiting her father, a man named Gerald, who had driven up from Savannah and was staying in a hotel nearby. Renee brought him along. I had met Gerald twice before, once at the wedding and once at Cooper's baptism. Both times he had been polite in the stiff, performative way of a man who is very aware of his own presence in a room. He had a politician's handshake and a real estate agent's smile and eyes that took stock of everything and assigned it a value. I had never trusted him, but he was Renee's father, and so I welcomed him into my home the same way I welcomed everyone, warm, open, without conditions. "Something smells good," Gerald said when he walked in, and the way he said it managed to be both a compliment and a mild surprise, as if he had not quite expected my house to smell good. "My father-in-law's stew," Daniel said. "Ruth's recipe. Best thing you've ever eaten, Gerald. I promise you that." Gerald made a non-committal sound and looked around the living room. Renee was quiet beside him, smoothing the front of her jacket. We gathered in the living room while the stew finished. Walt was telling a story about his truck. Lily had climbed into my lap and was asking me to help her practice the spelling words she had due Monday. Cooper was somewhere behind the couch making the sounds of a train. It was loud and warm and imperfect in all the right ways. I looked around the room at these people, my family, the thing Ruth and I had built together over 40 years, and I felt a fullness I hadn't felt in a long time. Then Renee's phone rang. She stepped into the hallway, and I could hear the low murmur of her voice, but not the words. When she came back, her face had changed. The Renee and Nay. She looked at her father, some communication passing between them that I couldn't read. Gerald set his glass down on the coaster with a deliberate click. I went to the kitchen to ladle the stew into the serving bowl. Lily came with me, as she always did, wanting to help. I let her carry the breadbasket to the table, and she did it with the gravity of someone carrying something holy. I carried the stew out and set it at the center of the table, right beside the chrysanthemums. It looked right. It looked the way Sunday dinner was supposed to look. Everyone moved to the table. Daniel read a short grace the way his mother had taught him, thanking God for the food, for the family, for the year, for the ones no longer with us. He paused on that last part the way people do when they mean it and not just as a ritual. Lily reached over and took my hand under the table. And then Gerald cleared his throat. "I have to say something," he said, his voice carrying easily over the quiet of the prayer's end. He was looking at the stew. "Renee has a sensitivity. She can't eat beef. Not like that." He gestured toward the pot with 2 fingers. "The richness. It causes problems. It causes problems. It causes problems." I would have thought someone would have checked before going to all this trouble. The table went very still. I looked at Renee. She was not looking at me. She was looking at her plate. I said, carefully, "Renee, I'm sorry I didn't know. I would have made something else. Is there something in the kitchen I can put together for you?" It's... "She can't eat here," Gerald said. Before Renee could answer, his voice had dropped into something flatter, more deliberate. "The potatoes are probably cooked in the same pot. The bread, who knows what's in it. She'll just have to wait." He looked at his watch. "There's a restaurant 20 minutes from here. We'll go after this. Anna close." "Dad?" Renee said quietly. "I'm looking out for you," Gerald said, in the tone of a man who had used that sentence to end a great many conversations. Daniel had set down his spoon. Gerald continued, "And what happened next is the part that I still hear sometimes in the early morning when the house is quiet." He looked at the stew, Ruth's stew, the stew I had spent 2 days making, the stew that Lily had stirred on her step-stool with all the seriousness of an 8-year-old girl trying to hold something sacred, and he said, with a kind of mild, dismissive authority, "Besides, this kind of food is very heavy, very old-fashioned. It's really not appropriate for a dinner party." He picked up his water glass. "No offense." The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever sat inside. I looked at the chrysanthemums in the center of the table. I looked at the blue-rimmed dishes Ruth had chosen in a shop in Gatlinburg. The summer we got married. I looked at Lily, whose face had collapsed from proud to confused, because she had helped make this food and could not understand why the man across the table was saying it was wrong. I felt the heat rise in my face and then, with a discipline that cost me something, recede. I was not going to do this. Not here. Not at Daniel's birthday dinner. Not in front of the children. I said, "I apologize for the inconvenience," and I meant it to close the subject. But Gerald was not finished. He turned to Daniel, not to me, and said, "You know, I've always thought you could stand to live somewhere more centrally located. Somewhere with more options." He said it casually, the way you say something you have been waiting to say for a long time and have finally found an opening for. "It's a long drive out here. Sex." End quote. "Especially with the kids getting older. They need access to things." He paused. "And Renee worries about your father. Whether he's managing. Out here alone." End quote. Daniel said, "Gerald. I'm just raising it." Renee and I were talking. Daniel said his wife's name. A question quiet and direct. Renee looked up finally. Her expression was something I could not quite name. "Dad? This isn't the time." "When is the time?" Gerald asked, pleasantly. "What happened next, I will carry for the rest of my life." Daniel stood up. Not fast. Not with the scraping back of the chair drama of a man losing his temper. Except, convent. Daniel stood up. He simply stood up, the way a man stands up when he has made a decision and the decision is final and he wants everyone in the room to feel its weight. He looked at Gerald. Not at Renee. Not at me. At Gerald. And his voice, when it came, was the quietest voice in the room. "Plus, this is my father's home," he said. "That is my mother's recipe. My daughter stirred that pot this morning, and she was proud of it, and she should be." He paused. "You are a guest here, and I need you to behave like one." Gerald's face arranged itself into a smile that did not match his eyes. "Son, I'm not trying to sell. I'm not your son," Daniel said, still quiet, still completely level. "And I'm asking you to stop." And the smile flickered. Walt's wife very quietly excused herself to get a glass of water. Daniel sat back down. He picked up his spoon. He looked at Lily and said, "This smells incredible, Bug. You did a great job." And he took a bite of the stew, unhurried, deliberate. Lily watched him, then looked at me, then picked up her own spoon. Gerald said nothing further. He ate his bread. He drank his water. He did not look at me again. Tap, tap, tap. The dinner was not ruined, but it was not what it had been. The warmth that had filled the room before came back slowly, the way warmth does after a door has been opened and closed quickly on a cold night. Walt carried us through with stories and questions, the way he always did, the way he had been doing since we were boys. Lily finished her stew and asked for more, and the pride of that small, ordinary thing steadied me more than anything else could have. After dinner, Gerald and Renee left early. Gerald shook my hand at the door, the politician's handshake again, firm and meaningless. I said it was good to see him. He said, "The same." Then they were gone. Daniel helped me wash the dishes. We worked in silence for a while, the way fathers and sons sometimes can, the silence being its own kind of conversation. Then he said, without looking at me, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "You have nothing to be sorry for. I should have said something sooner, when he started with the food, and you said exactly what needed to be said, and at exactly the right moment." He dried a blue-rimmed dish and set it carefully in the stack. Mom would have had something to say about all of this. "Your mother," I said, would have let him finish and then offered him seconds with such warmth that he would have spent the whole drive home feeling terrible about himself without quite knowing why. Daniel laughed, a real one, sudden and surprised, and it broke something open in the room. We laughed together for a moment there at the kitchen sink, and it felt like being given something back that I hadn't realized had been taken. I didn't sleep well that night. The house was quiet in the particular way it is after people have left, all their noise and warmth still faintly present in the air, like a scent. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of decaf and thought about Gerald's face when he looked at Ruth's stew. Old-fashioned, bi-end, not appropriate. It said, the casual, surgical way some people diminish what others have built with love. I thought about Lily on her step stool with the big wooden spoon, asking me if she was doing it the way Grandma used to. I thought about the fact that Gerald had said, "Renee worries about you managing out here alone." And I understood then that this was not a single incident. This was a pattern. He had been telling his daughter things about me, building a picture. The absent-minded old man, alone in his farmhouse, a responsibility, a burden, an inconvenience in the geography of their lives. I understood it in my bones the way you understand certain things when you have lived long enough to recognize the architecture of what people are constructing around you. I called Daniel the next morning. He answered right away. I said I just wanted to check in on him. He said he was okay. His voice had the texture of someone who had not slept either. He told me that he and Renee had talked late into the night, that it had been hard, that she had defended her father at first, the way people defend the thing that raised them even when they can see the cracks in it. He said he had asked her a simple question. What did my father do wrong? And that she had not been able to answer it. She had sat with the silence of that question for a long time. I told him I wasn't angry at Renee. He said he knew. I told him I thought she was a good woman who was being pulled in a direction by someone with more practice at pulling than she realized. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That's very generous, Dad." I said, "I've been thinking about your mother." He said, "Me too." The weeks after were quiet but not peaceful. I heard from Walt that there had been tension in Daniel's house. In DF, I did not ask for details because I knew they would find me anyway, and they did, slowly in fragments. Renee was not speaking easily to Daniel. Gerald had called several times from Savannah. There were long conversations held after the children were in bed. I felt the weight of being the center of something I had not chosen to be the center of, and I tried to carry it carefully, the way you carry something that could break. Then, about 3 weeks after Daniel's birthday, my doorbell rang on a Wednesday morning. I was not expecting anyone. I set down my coffee and went to the door. Renee was standing on the porch, alone. She was in her work clothes, but her eyes were unmade, raw, the way a face looks when it has been used for crying and hasn't quite recovered. She had a dish in her hands, covered with foil. I said her name. She said, "I owe you something." Her voice was steady, but only just. "I owe you a real apology, and I owe it to your face, not over the phone and not through Daniel." I opened the door wider. "Come inside." She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Lily had done her spelling words, where we had all gathered for what was supposed to be a good evening. She set the dish on the table and folded her hands around it and then looked at me with the kind of directness that costs something. "I cannot blame my father for what happened," she said, "and I want you to know that I heard that sentence clearly, that I registered its exactness." End quote. He said what he said, but I was sitting right there. I know what your wife meant to this family. I know what that recipe is. I watched Lily stirring that pot and I was proud of her, and then I sat there and let my father call it old-fashioned. And I said nothing. That was my failure, not his. Gay. Mine. She pressed her lips together. "I have been letting my father tell me a story about you for a long time, that you're lonely and difficult and set in your ways and that you hold Daniel back somehow. That's the word he uses. That you hold him back." She shook her head slowly. And I listened. I'm ashamed that I listened. I let the silence sit for a moment because it deserved to. "How long has he been saying these things?" I asked. "Years," she said. "Not always in those words. Sometimes it was just the way he talked about visiting here. The drive, the inconvenience. The way he'd say, 'Of course your in-laws need a lot of attention,' as if you were a project." She looked down at the dish. "Bayan, he was the one who first suggested you might be better off somewhere smaller. An apartment, maybe. Somewhere more manageable." Her voice had gone thin at the edges. "And he said it would be easier for everyone." The air in the kitchen felt very still. "I want to tell you something," she continued, and looked back up at me. "Daniel had one condition for us moving forward. Not a list. One thing. He said I needed to come here, to you, and make it right in person. Not because he was punishing me, because he said you deserved it." She paused. "He was right. Itank." I looked at this woman, my son's wife, the mother of my grandchildren, who had sat at Gerald's table her whole life being told that his version of events was the reliable one. I knew that particular kind of conditioning. I had seen it do its work on good people, and I could see, sitting across from me now, a woman in the process of putting down a very heavy thing. "Renee," I said, "I accept your apology." She let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep. "My son loves you," I said. "He loved you enough to stand up for what was right even when it was hard, and he loves you enough to want you to stand up for what's right too. Adief, that's not a man who is giving up on his marriage. That's a man who expects more from it." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know," she said. "I know that. And those two children," I said, "need to grow up watching both their parents do the hard thing when it's called for. Not just one of them." Endove. She nodded, and she kept nodding, and she picked up the foil-covered dish and held it out to me. "I made you beef stew," she said, and her voice broke on the last word, just slightly. "I called Daniel and asked him for the recipe. He said his mother kept it on a notepad in the kitchen drawer. He described it step by step. I wrote it all down." She swallowed. "It's probably not right. I'm sure I got something wrong, but I tried." I took the dish from her and held it, and the warmth of it came through my palms. "I'm sure it's perfect," I said. She shook her head. "It's not, but I tried." "Then it's perfect," I said. She stayed for almost 2 hours. We talked in the way people talk when they are trying to learn each other, really learn each other for the first time. I told her about Ruth, 5, about the shop in Gatlinburg where she chose those dishes, about the first time I made the stew alone after she was gone, how I stood at the stove for 10 minutes before I could bring myself to lift the lid, because I knew that once the smell filled the kitchen I was going to cry, and I was right, and I did. And then I made the stew anyway because that is what you do. She listened to all of it. She didn't try to fix any of it. She just listened, which was exactly the right thing. When she left, I stood at the kitchen window and watched her car pull out of the driveway, and I felt the specific kind of peace that only comes at the end of something that has required genuine courage from more than one person. It was another 2 weeks before Daniel called to invite me to Sunday dinner. He said to come early. He said Lily had something she wanted to show me. When I walked in, the house smelled of stew. Lily was on a step stool at the stove, stirring. She had an apron on a proper child's apron, blue with yellow ducks, that I had not seen before. She turned around when I came in and her face was enormous with pride. "Mommy taught me," she said. "We've been practicing." Renee was at the counter, dicing bread for the basket. She looked at me over her shoulder with a small, real smile. Daniel handed me a glass of sweet tea and said, "You're early enough to help, old man." He said old man the way sons do when it means something like, "I love you, and I see you, and I'm glad you're here." We sat down to dinner, all of us, and Daniel said grace, and he paused again on the part about the ones who are no longer with us, and this time the pause didn't feel like sorrow. It felt like a door left open so someone could walk through it if they wanted to. Lily served the stew herself, carrying each bowl carefully with both hands to the table with the concentration of someone bearing something precious. She set one down in front of me first. "Is it right, Grandpa?" she asked. "Does it taste like Grandma's?" I took a slow, careful sip from the spoon. The warmth of it moved through me, not quite Ruth's, not quite Renee's, but something that held both of them in it, something that was already on its way to becoming its own. "Yes, sweetheart," I said. "It tastes exactly right." And Lily smiled that gap-toothed, full-force smile and went and got her own bowl and sat down, and the table filled with the sound of everyone eating and talking at once, which is the best sound in the world. I drove home that evening through the Tennessee hills with the windows down a little, despite the cold, just to feel it. The road was dark and familiar. I had driven it 1,000 times, and I would drive it 1,000 more, God willing. When I pulled into the driveway and let myself in the back door, the kitchen held the particular quiet of a room that has been empty for a few hours and is glad to have someone return to it. On the counter sat Renee's dish from 3 weeks ago, washed and waiting to be returned. I had not given it back yet. I wasn't quite ready to. I put the kettle on, and I stood in the kitchen in the dark, except for the light above the stove, and I thought about Ruth, and about what it means to pass something forward, a recipe, a way of moving through a kitchen, a particular kind of patience that a woman spends a lifetime building and then leaves behind in the people who loved her. I thought about Lily on her step stool asking if she was doing it the way Grandma used to. I thought about Renee in that same kitchen, calling Daniel on the phone to ask him for a recipe, writing it down in her own handwriting, trying. The kettle whistled. I made my tea. I sat down at the table, and the house didn't feel empty. It felt like a place where things had happened and were still happening, where the people you love are always, in some small way, still moving through the rooms. That is enough. That has always been enough.